We're starting up.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's Alpine webinar. The title of today's session is The Journey: Buying Enterprise Software Effectively. The information discussed in this session represents the views of the individuals and does not constitute legal advice. You should consult with your organization's leadership and legal counsel, and we appreciate everybody being here. My name's Greg Utter. I'm one of the senior managing directors at Alpine Supply Chain Solutions. I will be your moderator today. Joining me in this session are two of Alpine's experts, Thomas Ryan, who's a senior director into the systems practice, and Mike Abarelli, also a senior director in the systems practice. Both of them have in excess of 20 years WMS supply chain experience and expertise. Tom, a little more years than that, but we will keep that under wraps. Appreciate you guys being here once again. So the overall agenda for today, you can see to the right, and just in general, the webinar covers a typical full cycle selection process, no matter what type of software solution that you're looking at. And it's going to include details about the RFP, what that means and how it works, demonstrations, vendor presentations when we get to that point, all the due diligence that takes place in making a selection, and finally contracting. And just a heads up, removing or cutting any one of these individual parts that I just spoke of a second ago out of this full selection cycle can add risk, significant risk. So this total process and the steps A through Z is really focused at mitigating that risk and making sure you end up with a solution that is generally a 10 to 15-year solution. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom, and thank you, Tom, so much.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. So as we talk about doing selection and implementations, Alpine, we've developed what we kind of call the 6 steps to success model. And as Greg said, it's focused at helping you mitigate the risk of making a selection like this. This is a big deal. You know, if you're looking at a warehouse management system, maybe you could consider it a kidney transplant. Looking at an ERP, maybe you think of it as a heart-lung transplant. Bottom line is you're operating something, you're ripping something out, you're sticking something new in. It affects a lot of the organization. So it is a challenge to execute. You need to be looking at this going beyond the mechanics. Specifically, company leadership, executive management needs to be involved, bought in, monitoring what's going on, and helping the team feel their support and guidance. The team itself needs to be the best workers, subject matter experts. This is the beginning of gaining buy-in by having those type of people involved in the selection and involving others of their peers and maybe their subordinates with regard to what your requirements are. It's the beginning of gaining buy-in. Focus on the goal. Make sure you understand what that goal is and what is the team supposed to be doing and how are you going to define success of the project. Be methodical. You need a deliberative, thorough, and structured process. The process helps guide you through all the variations that happen when you're interacting with all the different vendors that you would be considering. I often call it herding cats, and it really is a confusing process sometimes. Anticipate change. The organization is going to change. The new software gets a vote on how you operate. That means people's processes and steps and activities and methods of doing things will be changing. The only question is, do you want to get in front of that change or do you want to chase it? I highly suggest you plan for it and get in front of it. Anticipate that it's going to happen. Doing due diligence. Diligence is important. The selection process will help you find software. It'll help you see how it operates. But you've got to be able to go in deeper and look for how does the vendor operate? If they're involving a systems integrator, how do they join into the picture? Does their culture fit with your culture? Is the technology mapping with where you want to go? How well is it going to be doing? How well does it do integrations? How well will it support you? Doing integrations is nothing new for most of these softwares. However, you doing integrations may be something new for you. How do you do that and how do you execute it is typically the most difficult thing to get done correctly. You want to talk to references. You want to make sure that what you hear from the vendor is what you're hearing from the client's references, the people that have worked with them. And does it fit your world? I mean, is it, do they have experience with your particular flavor of the industry that you're in? Contracting. Many of you are probably operating on-premise software. Contracting for on-premise software, supporting it and whatnot is very different than what most softwares are being sold as today, which is in the cloud or software as a service. So you want to make sure you understand what the contracts allow and don't allow. Execution. It's all about once you select it, you got to screw it in. Screwing in software is not easy. You need to plan for it. You need to orchestrate it. Remember that you have deliverables to the vendor, so the vendor can do their deliverables to you. There are things that they're not going to do for you that you need to do for yourself, or you need to bring in a third party to help you do those things.
Cool. So a couple things, Tom, back on that previous slide. Why can't we just have the vendors come in, do their normal demonstration, give the company sales pitch, and then that based upon the functionality fit and their pricing? Why can't we just choose a vendor with that guidance?
Well, when the vendor comes in, they're going to show you the story of their best way to describe the story. And that may or may not cover all the things that are important to you. So you need to be able to guide the vendors to responding to what your requirements are. You are looking at a 10 to 15 year relationship. Some people think that because we're talking about in the cloud software, it's easy to swap it out, but it's not. You're talking about all the behaviors of people on the floor or in an office. If you're looking at a warehouse management system, the users are not typical users associated with doing office work and dealing with computers. So transitioning them, training them, it's not something you can just walk away from real easily. And the other thing is, it's also not so much that they can do a particular function, it's often about how they do it. And does that how fit in with how you think you want to run your business? So you've got to make sure all the different parts match up to your needs. You're not going to get that story by just listening to their off-the-shelf demonstration.
Great, thanks. And that leads to one last question on this slide. So you mentioned it here, the focus on the goal. The team needs to be focused on project success. I can tell you over the last several WMS selections that we've done, in this case, they were specifically WMS, when we asked the customer what is their metric of success, we got a lot of blank looks, right? And some metric of success is just to do a technology swap or a technology upgrade. Some are looking for full feature function. But if you don't define that metric of success up front and shoot for that as your goal and keep that in mind through the entire process, I think you lose sight of why did we do this in the first place.
Well, and there's a couple different ways to look at metrics of success as well. Am I going to get additional value, savings, efficiency, or whatever in how I run my business? That's a longer term measure of success. But then there's measures of success related to the selection itself and the implementation itself, which obviously needs to be successful if you're going to have a chance to get to the other stuff.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So the other thing I want to point out here is, what are we trying to avoid by having a deliberate methodology? Another part of my life has been involved in doing expert witness work. And I jokingly refer to that as when people say, what does that mean? I call it software implementation failure forensic pathology. How did this thing die and who killed it? Because by the time you get to law and court, you're not interested in working with each other anymore. So as a part of doing that, I did a bunch of research on how these things fail. And, some college professor did a really nice job, big paper that he wrote, and he identified 18 different things. And I looked at the 18 different things and I said to myself, the software vendor could do this. The software implementer or integrator could do these. the client could do these. And the net result was any one of them might not kill you, but a combination of some of them could kill you. And the idea of, from my point of view, talking to the software buyer is what are the things that you need to make sure are in place to help avoid that kind of problem. One, we talked about earlier, organizational commitment. The implementation has to be owned by the operational staff that's going to use it, not the IT department. They don't have to live with it the same way that operations has to live with it. You need to have realistic expectations of what you're going to get out of this thing. Make sure you do the due diligence in your selection. You don't want the vendor to be a bad match for you. People always talk, when you talk to the clients, references, they're going to tell you they wish they would have tested more, they wish they would have trained more. It's almost comical with regard to how many people hear that and then how many people have the same complaint when they get done doing their own thing later on. If you're trying to maintain the status quo of how you do business, don't go looking for new software. Why spend the money for something and then try to make it do exactly what you already do? You need to think about that and recognize that implementing new software, as I said earlier, is going to cost change. And when you make the transition from old to new, there's your time to clean up data, old data, get rid of stuff that's causing problems from the existing system, and make sure you don't load it up. Lots of different things to think about. We think if you follow this process and then you go to the next step and do good client-side responsibility actions, that you're doing the right kinds of things to mitigate risk and ensure success.
Yeah, so that brings up, we got a question from the audience. And by the way, if you have more questions, please use the chat icon and we can answer those. Someone was asking, well, you mentioned implementation duration, not enough design, not enough test time. How do you supplement the team when everybody also has a 40-hour work week or more in their day job?
That's a challenge. You look at it in the context of recognizing these new people or these people supporting the implementation become your experts for that new implementation and help give you the support you need going forward. That could translate into taking people out of their day job, making them full-time in the project, and then becoming full-time in support later on, which means you backfill them in their current day job. The other side looks at it and says, how can I supplement my own resources with external resources? Building training materials, building test scripts, doing test plans, writing work instructions, writing SOPs. All these things are necessary as a part of getting yourself enabled to be able to be successful. And the vendors aren't going to do that. But there are people out there, we'll raise our hand, there are people out there that can help you do that kind of stuff and leave you with those materials and some of your people well-trained. And that would be a supplementation approach. Two different ways to look at it.
Thank you, Tom.
So, the vendor and the implementation both matter. If you can have a moderately good fit vendor be a failure because you really screwed up on how the implementation went, or the vendor's methodologies wasn't effective at getting it done, or maybe even the vendor was just too busy and had sold a bunch of work and you couldn't get their attention during the implementation. But at the same time, you could have a well-executed implementation give you strong success when the vendor you chose may not be as good a fit. So software fit is all about doing the selection right. You definitely want to be reasonably close or excellent in terms of the vendor match and the functionality match, all that stuff we're going to talk about matching to your needs. And then the implementation quality talks to how do you screw that software in. Both matter. Both make a point in enabling you to be successful.
Okay. And with that in mind, it sounded like you have to learn more than just whether there's feature function during the demonstration. right? It's got to be the things that you can't demo, the things that are non-tangible fit of the customer, how it's deployed in other sites, and those other things that go above and beyond just the feature functionality.
Yeah, that's true. When you look at a well-developed RFP, and folks, they can be really horrible. I mean, in terms of how much information is in there, and it seems like it's a really big deal to complete, and it is. It's an even a bigger deal to read the answers and understand what you've been told by the different vendors. But a good one will deal with non-functionality related things like, tell me about your company. What businesses, what markets have you been in? What kind of clients do you have that look like me? What are your implementation processes and methodologies? How do you provide service and support? How do you do integrations? What's your product roadmap? What's the future going to look like? If I sign up with you, am I on a dead end path, or am I on something that's going to continue to grow? You need to give them time to do that. When we run a selection, we look at that and call that the vendor presentation Q&A session. We do that separately. Think of it as all those things that can't be demonstrated but need to be talked about. And then you've got the demonstration. The demonstration needs to focus on what my requirements are. How do you operate? Show me how it works. I want to see it happen. The first one, when you look at it and assessing an RFP, it's kind of like grading a term paper. Everything's in writing, which is nice. It's good. You've got backup to what you've been told, back to the mitigating risk thing I talked about earlier. But then the presentation and the demonstration, that's like assessing somebody's master's dissertation. So you're getting a combination of written response and information, and then you're getting the presentation, the interaction. The reality, though, is you're dealing with the sales team and the pre-sales team. So now you go and do the due diligence with their clients. You do deep dives on technology, deep dives on integration. When you get into that stuff, the sales guys bring the worker bees into the picture. They bring the support people into the picture. So then you get a chance to see what are the people like that I'm going to be living with, as opposed to the guys that sold me this thing, right?
Yep.
And then the clients give you that checkpoint. Now, no vendor is going to recommend somebody that they screwed up, right? You're going to get people that are their fans. But even their fans will sit back and they will often reveal some very interesting stuff about the vendor. And they'll also reveal very interesting stuff about themselves and what they thought they did right and what they thought they did wrong. It's amazing how open people can be. And you're beginning to establish a relationship there.
Yep. Okay. So there's a question here, and it's a really good question, and it's going to lead into some of the information that Mike Abarelli is going to present in just a minute. But at a very highlight, the question is, how do you call the numbering system in some ERPs that are sales orders? Each fulfillment starts with a sales order number and adds a suffix for each shipment, right? So this question deals with specific ERP functionality. And when Mike gets to his section, one of the things that we talk about is the design as you move forward in an implementation. So we're going to kind of field not the answer to this specific question, but how do we surface those really deep technical and functional questions as we move through it. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Thank you for the question, though.
Oh, but by the way, that also, and yes, Mike is going to cover that, but that also begins to feed into the point of I was making earlier. It's not so much that they can do it, it's how they do it.
Right.
And is that methodology for managing order and shipment effective for how you want to run your business? Or are you willing to make the change in how you run your business to be joining up with that?
Right. So we're going down a design rabbit hole. We need to come back up to the surface. And
so we'll come back up. So, details matter. You need to apply the right expertise to drive that selection. And driving a selection, there are a lot of people in your organizations out there, the people that are on the call, that have spent their lives taking care of software, implementing software, modifying software. But if you go shopping, if you go talking to them, you will find very few people that have actually bought software. And the buying process is a skill set of its own. You bring the expertise of what you need to the table, but you may need help with someone who can bring the expertise of actually how to translate that set of requirements and expertise into questions and interpreting the answers that the vendor is going to give you. The example I give when we go out to do requirements gathering, if I talk to the people on the floor and ask them what their requirements are, they're going to tell me how they do their job. They're not going to tell me what their requirement is. I don't care to a certain degree how they do their job. I want to understand what it is they're trying to accomplish. That's the requirement. And that's part of what is the skill set. You also want industry experience, who's been out there doing it, who vendor and the vendor market experience. You need to understand all of those kinds of things. And the idea of solution application that Mike is going to talk about, where we talk about, you know, when you take something out and plug something new in, other things get disturbed. We call that solution architecture for your IT portfolio, the systems portfolio that you operate. You need to take that into consideration. The vendors, their solution architecture is all about how they build their solution, not necessarily about how it fits into your existing world. The imperatives that you need to pay attention to: objectivity, risk management, and leadership. Guide the way through through internal interests and requirements, move the organization forward. Risk management, build in the processes and methodologies to mitigate the risk, the other stuff that we've already talked about. And then objectivity, you need to talk about, legacy versus new, vendor versus vendor. These are all things that you may want to consider. Sometimes the decision going forward is to not do a new solution. Maybe it's to do an upgrade to the existing solution instead of replacing it.
Great.
So finally, I will my last slide for a while. We'll get and then we'll get Mike on board. Again, details matter. You need to develop the business case, and that's kind of coming down to that fourth point. This process is expensive for you and the vendors. Is this really something you need to do? Are you willing to make changes? If not, why do this? Is do nothing a real option for you? I'll give you an example. I had a client that had been running the same software for 10 years. It was an on-premise solution. They paid maintenance every year. They never did any upgrades. At 10 years, they thought it was no longer doing everything that they wanted to do. They wanted to go out and buy something new. We talked to them and said, let's identify the requirements. Let's have the existing vendor reply to that set of requirements and demonstrate that set of requirements before we go shopping for anybody else. If they can't do what you want to do, then go shopping. But they could. And so they were then able to implement it. Yes, it's a big implementation, 10 years of no changes. That's a do-over. And it was a big job, but a big deal. But for them, they'd already paid the license fees. They didn't need to put that money on the table. And so with that, I am going to pass on to Mike.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
Hey guys, I'm Mike Aberelli. I'm going to talk us through our playbook a little bit. So this is a little more WMS specific in terms of timeline. It often takes us somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 months to do these. I'm not going to talk through every bullet point here. There's a lot. I'll just share some of our lessons learned on a couple of the key ones. So if we look at kind of the first project phase, really putting together the RFP as our main deliverable. And a call out there is don't take shortcuts. This is a major investment the company's making. You can easily go out to Google and search up, a WMS RFP selection template. There's a couple good ones out there. They look comprehensive. They've got, let's say, 15 tabs and 500 questions, and they look great. You could slap a logo on it and fire it in, but the vendors have seen those, and kind of their view on that is going to be, hey, if you're going to spend 15 minutes on the RFP, they're probably going to spend 15 minutes responding. So, put a lot of effort into it. It's worth it for, the investment that the company is going to make. The other call out I'd make there in terms of RFP, especially in the WMS space, what we've seen over the last 5 years is it's a mature market, and there's a lot of parity there between the vendors. So we're often challenged to pull in kind of a scrappy, up-and-coming vendor into the selection process to help keep the big guys kind of honest and aggressive in terms of pricing. And even when you look at these RFPs that Tom mentioned, if you could score them blind, the end result, the scoring is going to come back. It's all going to be within kind of plus or minus, let's say 10%, even if you get creative on your scoring and your weighting, and really within 5%. So they come back super, super close. It's a mature market. They're just not as much of a differentiator in terms of this process. But kind of stepping ahead to step 2 or step 3 here, Where we do think it's important to spend a lot of time is really on the demo. If you think about that solution evaluation, for the most part in these, you've got 1 day for the vendor, the demo. If you do the math on the time frame, you back out lunch and breaks and Q&A and those kind of things, you've got 6 hours. And if you script that out, you ballpark got maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 scenarios. So make sure that you're putting the scenarios that are most important for your company in front of that vendor for them to demo, and push them hard during that session. Try and get them out of their core demo scripts. A lot of these solutions, especially over the last couple of years, have a tremendous amount of configuration and workflow capabilities where you can do things without touching code that you just couldn't do 10, 15 years ago. So make sure in your demo scenarios, put together some really hard, tricky ones, and see how they come back and how they demo. Because what often happens, whoever kind of loses the demo, those guys get cut pretty quickly. If you're a vendor who's a number 1 or number 2 in terms of score and demos, they're going to have they're going to end up being close to one of the winning candidates in terms of selection process. So spend time there. The vendors definitely spend a lot of time there. I think I've heard for every hour of demo time in front of a customer, they probably spend 8 to 16 hours of prep time getting ready. So make sure you really leverage the 1 day of the demo, most important day on these projects. And then the second call out, and Tom mentioned it earlier, is really on these technical deep dives. That's where there's a lot of differentiators right now in the WMS space. So you think about 10 years ago, Tom mentioned on-prem. These vendors, some of them aren't even offering on-prem solutions anymore. So they're going to lead first with a cloud SaaS solution. If you ask for on-prem, they're still going to point you back to cloud. Some of them still offer it. If you do go down that path, they're going to let you know that they have split the code bases. Majority of their R&D is going into the cloud SaaS solution. So they're going to want to go there and make sure that you have that conversation and really understand where they're at on that journey. So it starts with their product team. That's kind of what we talk to in these deep dives. It ends up being a top to top with their CTO. But understand, have they already made that investment? Are they farther along on the journey where a bigger percentage of their R&D is going into the product and enhancements? Or are they still on that journey or early stages of that journey, and a lot of their R&D dollars are going into getting them to a cloud native platform that's driven around microservices? So that's really important things to understand where they're at on that journey. Tom, next slide, we can just kind of...
Right. We have a couple inputs here, Mike. So one of the things that we've seen is when you hand one of these RFPs that is significant for the vendors to reply to, tell us about what makes that a better result by having the vendors see the site before they answer it. Walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's 2 things. If you look at the end of that first phase where and actually, Greg, if you hop to the next slide, I can talk to it kind of in a timeline perspective.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
this kind of shakes it out. So that first month, the goal is to get that RFP out. And then while the vendor's got the RFP in hand and they can see the written requirements that Tom talked to, that's still a piece of paper. And it's often a big document. Those things are 100 pages long. It's hard to really understand it. So in parallel, as part of our playbook, while the vendor's working on the RFP, we have them out to tour the facility. We encourage them to bring their services team so they can actually walk the building, understand receiving, put away, picking and shipping. So they've got, eyes on the building as well as eyes on a piece of paper. So they really understand the customer's requirements. So it's both to your question, Greg.
I guess I would also add, the points you're making, Michael, are very appropriate for a warehouse management system. But when we talk about some of the other solution sets that we might be helping people do, say trade promotion, demand replenishment, stuff like that, don't necessarily need an on-site visit, but they definitely need face-to-face time, remote time to understand the requirements. You get into the ERP space, if it's just related to managing orders, and finance, not so much. But if manufacturing is involved, understanding how the manufacturing processes flow, that requires an on-site time. the bottom line is when you do a selection like this that we're talking about, you want to enable the vendors to do the best job they can do in responding to you. If they don't respond in the best way they can, how can you make a good decision? You're making a good decision off of a bad input. You got to enable them to be able to do their job. Back to you, Mike.
Okay, and then just to finish this up, again, it's more WMS centric, in terms of the phases. We talked about kind of the first phase, roughly a month to get the RFP out. Second phase, give the vendor a chance to respond to that RFP. 3 to 4 weeks is probably average what we see in the WMS space. Again, have them on site. And then kind of that final phase, final month is really focused on putting together the demo scenarios that are most important for you, and giving them to the vendor so they've got an opportunity to review and do the best job they can, Tom, like you mentioned during the demo.
Yeah, so a couple of adds. When we get back to preliminary pricing, because that's part of it, right? How much is the software going to cost? And there's usually, some closeness between vendors, but what we often see is a large disparity in implementation timeline and hours and cost. How do you navigate those waters between the customer and the vendor when you're doing this selection on seeing these big swags or swings in that area, Mike?
Yeah, it's challenging. We do the best we can to get to kind of an apples to apples comparison on those numbers. As we're going through that cost analysis process, we make sure the vendors are comfortable with the numbers that we're putting back in front of the client when they're reviewing the initial cost estimates. And then what we often do, Greg, is when we have a final two, we'll often do like an implementation workshop. Where we've got the vendor back on site, we've got someone from their services team, not necessarily their sales team, who is often the person putting together those estimates. And that's an opportunity to sit down at that table, kind of pull out the project plan, work through key assumptions, talk through roles and responsibilities, where the customer really has the ability to sit with the vendor and understand where the estimate's coming from and what's the duration, how many resources are going to be on that project to help really understand those cost numbers in more detail.
Okay, good. And then there's a question from the audience chat. How important is it to keep the vendor separate from the customer during this process?
Tom, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to
Yeah,
answer?
so I'm going to tell you that when you pick up the phone and you talk to a vendor for the very first time, you have started to negotiate and you don't know it. So when you involve a third party, say like us, we would advise you, we don't want to get in the way of an existing relationship you already have, like if the incumbent is also included in the process. But we do want you to stop talking to them about the process. Let us be the persons who help maintain a level playing field and who help maintain a consistency of message. And we know better, probably, not necessarily always, but probably better than you when we think we're negotiating and when we're not. Because we try to avoid that until we get down to the vendor of choice and alternate. We don't want that skewing, sorry, Freudian slip, skewing the input we get from them.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Mike.
So kind of our final observations, if you will, it's a new solution. It's a new vendor. You're starting a 10 to 15 year relationship. Folks, I've replaced stuff that has been running for 20, 25 years. And so when we say 10 to 15, that's probably not a bad number, right? Requirements are the measuring stick. It's not the what, it's the how. There's more in here. Mike's already touched on a bunch of this, the importance. And if you kind of look at it, RFPs are your first blush, demonstrations and presentations, you're getting more detail, more interaction with them. And you want to try to have some kind of way of assessing the vendors. That's a scoring mechanism. I will tell you that I'm an engineer. I love my spreadsheets, so I score everything. But I never let numbers make the decision. when we go through these vendor of choice and alternate meetings with people where you're taking 4 demos and trying to figure out who's the 2 winners, then you want to have a vendor of choice you spend a lot of time with. You want to have an alternate in the event that things blow up, because they do. And we start that session with gathering the subjective. What did you think about? What are the pros? What are the cons? And then we talk the numbers. And if the numbers and the subjectives don't match, we need to understand why. And that understanding why, not only because you got to explain it to the execs and maybe even other people as to why you made the decision you did, but it sometimes brings out things that were missed. And somebody saw and the numbers didn't pull it up, or someone got a false impression. You're listening to a lot of stuff. It's hard to keep this stuff straight. And the other thing is, if you don't do this scoring before you see the next guy, you're going to end up with some kind of Chinese menu choice on the 5th day when you're all sitting down, and you never saw a vendor that did all those things. One of the vendors did some of them, and another vendor did some of them, and so you got to work on trying to keep it straight. A good process will help you do that. And having said that, I guess I will turn it back to Greg, unless there's other questions.
No, they've got one more question here, and I'll answer it. What are we seeing as an ROI break-even time frame for a WMS? So that's a great question. And really what it has to do with is, what is your metric of success on doing this implementation? Is it, like I said earlier, a technology lift? Do you have a very, very good WMS today, but you're sunsetting it, or the vendor is sunsetting it, and the new WMS that you're purchasing is replacing something that has to be replaced? So I think it varies on what that ROI time frame is. I would say in general, if you're coming from a solution that is not what I would just call off-the-shelf software WMS, generally in the 15% overall productivity gain range. Now, will that get you the ROI break even in an 18 to 24 month time frame? Maybe or maybe not. So it all depends. But what I can suggest is we leverage an industry accepted tool within Alpine that can get you pretty darn close on what we think the ROI will be, or what that break even time frame is for the new WMS. And it takes into account a lot of things: the cost of the software, the cost of the implementation, the cost of your internal resources team, which many people don't think about, and then the cost of a third-party integrator such as Alpine to supplement your team that already has a full-time job. Is there any additional questions in the chat? If not, I would like to thank everybody here and invite you to our April webinar. It's called Mastering Labor Management in Your Distribution Center. That will be held April 17 at 1 p.m. Central. And the focus is on labor management. And that session webinar will be run by another senior managing director within Alpine. His name is Jim Chamberlain, been in the labor management space for over 20 years. So it should be an exciting webinar as well. So once again, thank everybody for your time and attention today. We appreciate it. Please feel free to reach out to us at Alpine, and we can answer any additional questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.